The Death Star wasn't just a weapon. It was the biggest money pit in galactic history, a moon-sized threat built by an empire that looked at normal military overspending and decided it still wasn't ambitious enough. I'm about to break down the full cost behind the Death Star and exactly how it decimated the Galactic Empire's economy. So be sure to drop a like and subscribe, and let's get into it. The funny part here is there isn't a neat line in the lore of Star Wars that gives us some kind of receipt on how much the Death Star cost. Nobody opens up an old dusty imperial ledger and says, oh yeah, here's the receipt for the Death Star. We don't have a labor bill, a bill for the work it took to get the Kyber crystals to fuel the super laser, or the cost of making a space station so huge it probably needed its own zip code. Unless you just want your mail flying around out there in the vast emptiness of space. The reason there's so much mystery around this is because the Death Star was built behind immense layers of secrecy, seized resources, forced labor, and corruption on such a scale that would make even the Trade Federation stop and stare in shock. So the real question isn't just how much it cost, it's about what made it cost so much. It's easy to look at the sheer size of it and think, yeah, must have been expensive, but there are several different factors that made it so tough to build. We'll start off with the superstructure itself, because it is huge. The Death Star was a planet killer, but before that it was just a giant metal shell the size of a small moon. Roughly 160 kilometers across, it was packed with docking bays, reactor systems, weapon emplacements, barracks, control centers, and enough machinery to make a shipyard look tiny. Even if huge amounts of raw material were seized instead of boards, those metals still had to be mined, refined, transported, shaped, and then assembled. A battle station that size would tear through staggering amounts of durasteel, wiring, plating, and armored hull material. This is why it's reasonable to assume this section alone cost 400 billion credits. Then there's actually fueling the reactor and power grid, which is where this thing stops being a giant shell and starts becoming a machine that can actually function for destruction. The Death Star had to power shield networks, tractor beams, thousands of weapons, life support for more than 1 million personnel, and of course, the super laser. That meant massive reactor technology, backup systems, thermal regulators, and power transfer lines on a scale that sounds completely insane because, well, it was. Even the biggest and grandest Star Destroyers pale in comparison to the sheer scale and complexity needed to fuel the Death Star. This causes fans to speculate that 150 billion credits were needed for this stage. Now we have the thing which makes the Death Star such a crazy concept, the super laser. It's hard to forget that this weapon had enough power to turn Alderaan into an asteroid field. The super laser wasn't some oversized turbo laser though. It was the entire reason that the Death Star was constructed. The physical boundaries needed to host such a powerful weapon, as well as the energy needed to fuel it, required an entire new creation unlike anything the galaxy had seen. That meant years of research, prototype testing, rare components being sought and created, precision focusing systems, and Kyber-based energy amplification on a monstrous scale. This likely cost around 200 billion credits, although it did take multiple decades for the research, since we know that before it was created, Palpatine was messing around with the plans, and before him, they were in the hands of the Separatists. Before we get into the rest of the video, if you've ever wanted a lightsaber that actually feels like it came straight out of the movies, you need to go ahead and check out Sabers Pro. Their hilts look like real on-screen replicas, the blades are super bright, and they're built tough enough for real dueling. Check the link in the description and use the referral code Luke's Temple when you pick one up at checkout to support the channel and save yourself some money on your order. Now, the Kyber crystals themselves deserve their own section, because these weren't just batteries you could grab off a shelf on Coruscant. Kyber was rare, difficult to acquire in bulk, and absolutely central to the weapon's function. Without it, the Death Star is just a very expensive ball floating in space. Even with the Empire seizing much of that supply after the fall of the Jedi, such as through their control of the planet Ilum, The extraction, transport, storage, and weaponization still carried a major financial cost. If we're going to be very conservative, we could say that the Kyber side of the project alone is 50 billion credits for the workers who needed to do the transportation, extraction, and implementation of the Kyber energy. Next up, we have construction infrastructure, which is one of those hidden costs which are way bigger than a lot of us would probably assume. The Death Star didn't just pop into existence in the middle of deep space. It needed construction yards, mobile platforms, specialist ship traffic, orbital logistics, staging areas, maintenance networks, droid teams, and a giant supply chain like the one we see in the prisons in Andor to keep the whole machine growing piece by piece over the course of years. Building something this big is expensive, but doing it in secret without anybody knowing costs a hell of a lot more. We're going to go with a number of 100 billion credits here as well. This might sound too conservative or even too liberal for some of you, but we have to bear in mind that this would have been a very major factor. Paying off people to be quiet, ensuring that any workers or prisoners taking part in the construction process were quiet, buying out the prisons and the staff themselves, and a whole host of other things including the actual transportation of the material to and from the construction yards in and out of space would all be extremely expensive. So I think this is a fair estimate. But that does bring us to an interesting question. How much would it cost to pay off everybody else? I mean, if we're thinking about the broader side of things, the Empire drove costs down with prisoners, slaves, Geonosian labor, and droids, which meant they weren't paying fair market wages across the board. But cheap labor isn't free, and once the Death Star was actually created, they needed a hell of a lot of guards, supervisors, engineers, and officers to be maintained, transported, fed, and protected, as well as, of course, given their salary. So while the labor was brutally underpriced by Imperial standards, the total manpower burden for a project this large still stands around 75 billion credits. Because remember, there were 1 million people stationed on the Death Star. So even if they had a small salary, that's a hell of a lot of money just for the staff. After that, we have miscellaneous fees, like the weapons, defenses, and internal systems beyond the super laser itself. It had to install, maintain, and power thousands of turbo lasers, ion cannons, tractor beams, sensor arrays, targeting systems, hangars, communication nodes, detention blocks, shield controls, and all the ugly little necessities of running such a huge military base in outer space. Although this would still be a crazy number, we're gonna round it out with 25 billion credits. And that brings us to the final count, 1 trillion credits. It's a clean total, but it's also the bare minimum, because we've been pretty generous here. In all likelihood, especially if you were to charge the Empire for access to slaves, this could be trillions of galactic credits. This explains why the destruction of the first Death Star hurt the Empire in a way that went far beyond just losing a weapon. It wasn't a simple military defeat, it was an economic disaster. For decades, the Empire had poured insane levels of material, labor, debt, and political capital into this one project, and then watched it vanish in a single explosion over Yavin. The greatest military flex in galactic history also became the galaxy's most expensive fireworks show. Naturally, that leaves us with one question. How did the second Death Star get made so quickly, and how much did it cost? Well, that sounds to me like a perfect opportunity for a part 2 of this video, but only if you really enjoyed it. So please leave a like on the video, subscribe for more awesome Star Wars content, and be sure to let me know if you want a follow-up to this video. Don't forget to check out Sabers Pro if you want an authentic looking, high quality lightsaber ready for dueling or perfect for display. Click the link in the description below or use the code Luke's Temple at checkout to save yourself some money while supporting the channel in the process. Thank you ever so much for watching, and as always my friends, may the Force be with you.